I was never a fearful child, and my curiosity for spooky or dangerous things was always immense. There were very few things that used to scare me because I was fundamentally a happy child, full of energy. In my childhood, I loved visiting my grandparents. They had a very large house with many nooks and crannies to explore, which was incredibly exciting for me as a child. One day, my parents planned to go away for a weekend, and I was thrilled because it meant I could spend the weekend at my grandparents' place. My parents made the decision spontaneously, so we quickly packed my belongings for the weekend, and my mother drove me to my grandparents' house. My grandma is a warm-hearted woman who loved all her grandchildren dearly, so she greeted me at the door with a hug. It was always wonderful to be at my grandparents' house, because I knew there was always something new to discover, like an old telescope in the attic or vintage Star Wars comics that probably belonged to my dad and his brother from their childhood. That's why I wanted to go upstairs immediately to see what I could find in my grandparents' house that day. As I stood on the second floor, about to climb the stairs to the fireplace room to greet my grandpa, who was watching soccer there, something caught my eye. In my father's old room, directly across from the stairs, sat a clown doll in the old leather armchair. It had a creepy smile on its face and was staring directly at me. It wore a typical clown costume, had dark red hair, and bright blue eyes. I took a step towards the room, and although the doll unsettled me, I was somehow intrigued because I had never seen it there before. Just as I was about to enter the room, my grandpa emerged from the fireplace room door and greeted me, saying, "Oh, it's wonderful to have you here for the weekend. We'll go out for ice cream in town later, my boy." I was delighted to see my grandpa, whom I had almost forgotten about, due to the fascination with the doll. I quickly pushed aside the unsettling feeling the doll had given me and spent a truly enjoyable afternoon with my grandparents. When evening came and we returned home, I went to get ready for bed with my grandma. I was to sleep in my father's old room that night, so I saw the doll again, smiling at me. The unsettling feeling from earlier returned, and I knew I wouldn't be able to close my eyes all night if I had to be observed by the doll from the armchair. My grandma quickly noticed my fear of the doll and asked if she should take it upstairs to the fireplace room. I simply nodded silently, and, to be honest, was quite relieved. When my grandma returned to my room, she assured me that I didn't need to be afraid of Charlie, and that he would spend the night upstairs. Then she went to her room, leaving a small gap in my door so that I could call out if anything happened during the night. I thought about Charlie and his damn smile all night before I finally managed to fall asleep. In the middle of the night, around 2:30 a.m., I was awakened by a squeaking door. Instinctively, I knew it could only be the door to the fireplace room because it was the only one that made such noises when opened. The squeaking made my whole body freeze because I knew my grandma and grandpa should be sleeping at this time. Just a few moments later, I heard the door to the fireplace room close. I immediately thought of Charlie, but I couldn't understand how a simple doll could open a door. Or was he not just a simple doll? The blood in my veins ran cold as I heard a faint scratching sound from upstairs. It sounded as if someone was scratching the wall with their fingernails or an object. Shortly after, I heard an incredibly shrill laughter that sent shivers down my spine. I covered my ears because I couldn't bear it anymore, and the laughter deafened me. My eyes were fixed on the gap in the door, and in the darkness of the hallway, I tried to make out the steps of the staircase leading down from upstairs. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, and a whistling sound came from above. I tried to make as little noise as possible, not wanting to show that I was awake and draw the attention of the clown or creature that stood upstairs towards me. As I tried to move in bed to get the flashlight from the dresser, which I always used in the darkness to go to the bathroom, the bed creaked, and the whistling from above abruptly stopped. Never in my life had I felt such fear as in that moment. There was a brief silence until I suddenly heard faint footsteps coming from the stairs, seemingly getting closer. I kept my gaze fixed on the door, my heart pounding like never before. Just a few seconds later, the door opened a bit more, and I saw its face. Its hideous smile was even wider and broader than it was in the afternoon, and I saw that it held something in its hand. It was long, sharp, and gleaming in the light from the street lamp that penetrated my room. Suddenly, the thing started moving and approached my bed. Its gait was laborious and seemed strenuous, as if it was moving on stilts. It stared at me, and its repulsive smile turned malicious and bloodthirsty. I wanted to call for my grandparents, but I couldn't make a sound. When the monster reached my bed, it climbed up and sat at the foot of my blanket. Now I could see the knife in its hand clearly. It was one of the cake knives my grandma kept in the cupboard upstairs for special occasions like Christmas or birthdays. The clown stood there at the foot of my blanket for a while, until it suddenly started laughing again. It was the same terrible laughter as from above. When it saw that I covered my ears, it fell silent and resumed its smile. Then it pointed its finger at me and climbed up the blanket towards my head. It growled softly and repeatedly reached for the blanket with its small hands, pulling itself closer to my head. At that moment, I had mentally already accepted my fate. Suddenly, the light in the hallway turned on abruptly, and my grandma entered the room, asking why I was still awake. In complete shock and almost in tears, I told her what had happened, but she didn't believe a word and only said that she was very impressed with the effort I had put into placing Charlie with a knife on my bed to make it look believable. She had just wanted to go to the bathroom and hadn't expected me to still be awake. That night, I could hardly sleep, but I was relieved that my grandma had taken the clown to her room. 10 years have passed since then. In the meantime, I have never stayed overnight at my grandparents' again. Today, I am 18 years old. Towards the end of the year, my family and I spent the first day of Christmas at my grandparents' place. I remember vividly how we sat at the table, eating cake together before the gift exchange. I immediately recognized the knife used to cut the cake, and from the corner of my eye, I saw the clown, who'd been smiling and watching me from the sofa the whole time. I had a best friend, and his name was Billy. We went to school together and spent almost every day together in our free time. One day, Billy stopped coming to school. I didn't see him for weeks, and I became very worried. One evening, when my parents were out, there was a knock on the front door. I ran to the door, opened it, and couldn't believe my eyes. Billy was standing outside. He was behaving very strangely. His eyes looked tired and bloodshot, and he seemed nervous. He kept looking around and constantly glanced over his shoulder. "I need to talk to you urgently," he said anxiously. I let him in and locked the front door. He sat on the couch in the living room and was extremely restless. His legs were trembling, and he couldn't relax. "Are you okay?" I asked him. "My parents think I'm crazy," he said. "Everyone thinks I'm crazy. Even I thought I was crazy for a while." "And are you crazy?" I asked him. Billy laughed humorlessly. "Please, look out the window," he said. "Why? Just look, please. Do me this favor. Look out the window and tell me what you see." To reassure him, I went to the window, pulled aside the curtains, and peered outside. "What do you see?" he asked me. "I see a few houses, a few cars, and a few streetlights." "Exactly," he said. "And do you notice anything strange?" No," I said. "Do you see the streetlights?" he asked me. "They should be on, but they're not. They're all off. How can it be that all the streetlights are off? Who do you think did that?" "I don't know," I said. Billy lowered his head and said softly, "The Thin Man." "What are you talking about?" I asked, astonished. "I've heard about him before," said Billy, "but I thought it was just a scary story or an urban legend. But it's not. The Thin Man is real, and he really exists. He hates streetlights. At first glance, he looks almost like a normal man. But when he transforms, he becomes tall and very thin, just like a streetlight. And he's dressed all in gray, just like a streetlight. He always stands next to one. When it's dark outside and the streetlights aren't lit, you don't even realize he's there." "How do you know all this?" I asked him. "Because I've seen him," Billy replied. When? A few weeks ago, I was playing with my soccer ball in the park in the evening and accidentally shot it into the bushes. I went to retrieve the ball from the bushes, and that's when I saw him. He looked a bit strange, but still appeared like an ordinary man. He was standing by the roadside, gazing up at the block of houses. When he felt unnoticed, he simply transformed. Suddenly, he became tall and extremely thin. It was really creepy, and I couldn't believe my eyes. Then he hid behind a streetlight. Suddenly, I heard a click, and the light went out. Then he glided to the next lamppost, and I heard another click, and that light went out too. He extinguished the lights of all the streetlights. Click, glide, click, glide, click, glide, until all the lights were out. Then he positioned himself next to a streetlight and looked exactly like it in the darkness. If you knew, like I do now, you could recognize him. But if you didn't know, he simply blended into the darkness among the streetlights. But then he noticed me. Suddenly, our eyes met, and I knew he had seen me, and he knew that I had seen him. I panicked, my heart racing like crazy, like a madman. I ran away without looking back. When I arrived home, I locked all the doors. After that, I was too afraid to leave the house. The fear was just too overwhelming. Then, I realized that it was only dangerous at night. It should be safe during the day. He only comes out at night because he hates being seen. No one believes me. My parents took me to a psychiatrist and she didn't believe me either. "Do you believe me?" "Of course, Billy," I said, trying to reassure him. "I believe you." "No, you don't," he said disappointedly. "Anyway, even if you don't believe me, I thought I should warn you. After all, you're my best friend." And then Billy stood up, said goodbye and left. At the front door, he looked around anxiously several times and ran off. I watched him until I couldn't see him anymore and went back inside. I felt so sorry for him. I felt like my best friend had lost his mind. The next morning, the police found Billy. He had been folded. There was no blood and no intestines were coming out, but every single bone in his body was broken. He had been folded into a tiny bundle. At first, the police didn't even know what they had found until they picked it up and saw his flattened face. His mother had to go to the police station to identify him. When they brought her into the room to show her his remains, she fainted. He was just a tiny bundle of flesh and bones, clothing and hair. He had been folded. Now I'm in a state of panicked fear, afraid that the same thing will happen to me. I can't stop thinking about the crazy things Billy told me. Suddenly, they don't seem so crazy anymore. I can't sleep anymore, and I'm so tired. I'm constantly nervous and constantly looking over my shoulder. When I went to school in the morning, I counted the streetlights on my street. When I went home in the evening, I counted them again. There was now one more.